What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. A long time ago, we're talking probably about 15 years ago, I read this story, Superman Batman Generations. This was a 4-issue miniseries that came out maybe in 1999, around that time, and each issue is roughly double size, and each issue has 2 stories in it. And the premise is, what if Superman and Batman and the entire DC universe happened in real time, and there was no comic book time. So Bruce Wayne first appears as the Batman in 1939, Clark Kent first appears as Superman in 1938, and then them and their supporting casts age in real time. And then each story jumps forward 10 years. So issue 1, we get a story in 1939 and a story in 1949, and then 59, 69, 79, 89, etc. And then we get to see John Byrne kind of play with real-world history, but also gets to play with how comic books were done in those eras. For example, in the 1950s, comic books were quite a bit sillier than they were in the 1980s. And so we get to see in the 1959 story, Superman is, I think it's either the 59 story or the 49 story, I can't remember now, but Superman is turned into a giant Frankenstein's monster by Red Kryptonite. And we get to see Mr. Mxyzptlk and Batmite, and that's kind of a goofy story that reflects the actual time period of what was coming out in that time period in real life. But Byrne is also working in real life stuff like the Vietnam War. That plays a pretty big part over the course of this narrative. And this story is one of my favorite Elseworld stories. Maybe my absolute favorite Elseworld story. I really love this story. I think it's a very interesting premise, and other people do as well, because over the last few years at Marvel, we have seen stories with a very similar premise. Spider-Man Life Story, which is the same thing. What if Spider-Man first appeared in 1962 and then aged in real time? And then there's also more recently been Fantastic Four Life Story with the same premise. And so I feel like this story has had a pretty significant impact on comics. At least in the last few years, we're seeing that impact. But for a long time, I felt like nobody was really talking about this miniseries or the world that it spawned. And I should go ahead and say right now, there was a Batman Captain America team-up story that John Byrne did before this. And as far as I know, that is actually where Byrne first got the idea of having characters aging in real time and tackling generations in this little alternate world. I do not have that issue. That is probably the one Superman-Batman Generations-esque story that I don't have. But anyway, I really love this story. I won't get too much into spoilers, because if you are able to track this book down, I would recommend that you get it. I think that it's very solid, very well told. By the end, I feel like it's very tightly kept together. I don't feel like there's very many, if any, loose plot threads that don't really make any sense. I overall just really enjoyed this story. And then, a year or two later, there was a sequel, Superman Batman Generations 2. Also, a 4-issue miniseries, each issue double size and each issue with 2 stories like the first miniseries. This one starts off in, I think, 1941, and then each issue jumps forward, or each story jumps forward 11 years. And this one, I do not like nearly as much. It does not have a single unifying story connecting everything that we see in this miniseries. This one is basically just a bunch of snapshots in between some of the stories that we got in Generations 1. We get to see Diana leaving Man's World, and then we get to see Alan Scott meet Abin Sur, who is the Green Lantern of Sector 2814. And then we get to see these little moments in this world, but it doesn't all connect into one much bigger story like Superman Batman Generations 1 does. And so really, with Generations 2, the only reason that I could think of that you would want to track down this story, well, if you're like me and you didn't know what it was, you read Generations 1, you loved it, and then you wanted to see the sequel and see what it does, and then probably you're going to be disappointed. This story isn't a story. It's just a bunch of little, oh, okay, and then this kid becomes Kid Flash. Oh, okay, and then Hawkman and Blackhawk, they have a descendant, and it was really weird when I was reading, I'll get to that in a minute, but you get you get to the end of this, and it doesn't really feel like it was a story. It just feels like, hey, did you know, at this point, so in Superman, I'm a little bit scatterbrained, and I apologize. In this one, I think it's in 1989, we find out that Hal Jordan is the president of the United States. And I thought, okay, that's kind of cool. And then in this one, we get a story that only exists to tell us that at one point, Hal Jordan, he has an adventure, he's doing a test pilot thing, he almost dies, and then he tells Carol, I'm getting too old to be a test pilot, but I was thinking of going into politics. And that story only exists if you read Generations 1, and then you said, I wonder how Hal Jordan became president. Now, for myself, reading Generations 1, I did not need the backstory on how Hal Jordan became president. I was able to figure out he went into politics and eventually became president. I didn't really need that one further. I didn't need my hand held there. But then in Generations 2, you get an entire story in one of the issues and then Hal Jordan decides he's going to join Congress. And it doesn't really have any purpose in the overall Generations 2 narrative. It's just there to say, remember how Hal Jordan was president? This is how that happened. At one point, you get to see this character who is Kid Flash, and then a few stories later, suddenly, there's another Flash. And I have no idea who this is or how they connect to the rest of the Flash family. And I think I would have liked this a lot better if it kind of shied away from Superman and Batman, and you could say, okay, their story has already been told. You can go and read Generations 1, and then this one, I wish it had leaned more into, let's show Wonder Woman and the Green Lanterns and the Flash. We can see how they evolved over the decades, and see what's going on with the Flash, what's going on with Wonder Woman's daughter, and we could have them have their own story, and then you could mention stuff from Generations 1. At one point, Superman is exiled to the Phantom Zone in Generations 1. You could have characters mention that in Generations 2, but overall, Generations 2 was pretty disappointing to me because it feels like it still needs to touch base with stuff that happened in Generations 1, and at the same time it loses track of what I feel like should have been the goal in telling its own story. Generations 2 is not its own story. It's just a bunch of little snapshots, like I said, of different stuff happening in this world, but it doesn't really have much substance on its own. So for a very long time, like I said, about 15 years, this was all that I had read from the Superman Batman Generations world. But there was a third miniseries, Superman Batman Generations 3, which has now been collected in this omnibus, which collects everything. So this collects the first two minis that I said, and then Generations 3, which is a 12-issue miniseries, and each issue is normal length, and each issue jumps forward 1 century into the future. And I waited what felt like an entire lifetime to finally be able to read Generations 3. I had tracked down some of the single issues of Generations 3 out in the wild, but I was never able to find the missing issues, so I was never able to read this story until this omnibus came out, and I got it for Christmas last year, and I reread Generations 1 and 2, and I got really excited to read Generations 3, and it might be the worst of the bunch. I really wish that John Byrne had quit while he was ahead and just did Generations 1 and that was it. I saw someone online who said that Generations 3 was their favorite of the stories, and you know what? That's fine. We can disagree. If you like Generations 3, that's totally okay. I, for one, think it's really awful, but this person said they think that a lot of people dislike Generations 3 because you have to put in a little more work in figuring out the plot of the story. I do not think that's true. I don't think the plot of Generations 3 is really that difficult to wrap your head around. It's a fairly simple plot. I just don't think that it's very good. Basically, the premise is about 700 years in the future, Darkseid, who had died at some point and then was resurrected, he gets this idea that he is going to create these parademons who are capable of independent thought. And they make a big deal out of that in a few issues, that these parademons, they can actually think. They're not like other parademons. And that ultimately goes nowhere. I don't know why they spend so much time focusing on that, but Darkseid has these parademons created, and then he wants to send them back in time in 100-year jumps. So he's going to send some parademons back 100 years, and they are going to attack Earth. And then if that invasion fails, then some of those parademons are going to jump further back another 100 years, and they will keep doing that. And I guess Darkseid thinks this is going to weaken the heroes of Earth. this is where I am a little confused, and I feel like I should be able to understand what's going on here. The idea of Darkseid using time travel to try and conquer the Earth really isn't that difficult of a premise to figure out, but at some point I kind of lost track of why is Darkseid doing this. At one point, Desaad says, if you send parademons back in 100-year jumps, aren't the heroes of now going to remember the last 700 years where you sent parademons further and further back in time? And Darkseid says, no, that's not how time travel works. But that is how time travel works, because we start in 1925 with Superboy and Bruce Wayne. He's not yet Batman, but I don't remember if he's Robin still, because we find out in flashbacks in Generations 1 that Bruce Wayne was Robin before he became Batman, and they are both in Smallville, and a parademon group attacks Smallville, and the army, the 1925 army, is able to defeat these parademons. So they weren't really that much of a threat. And then in 2025, some more parademons attack, and this kind of takes everyone by surprise. But then by the time you get to 2125, by that point, Batman is like, okay, there was 100 years between those two parademon attacks, and then he's pretty sure there's going to be another one. And so by that point, all Darkseid is doing is alerting the heroes of Earth that parademons are going to be attacking every 100 years. And then there's just a whole lot of fluff in this 12-issue miniseries that basically explains why Batman and Superman weren't able to finally defeat the parademons. At one point, Superman and most of the New Gods from the Fourth World, they get stranded in this other reality where they're not able to escape for like 500 years. And then Superman comes back, and then he tries to go into the future to talk to the Legion of Superheroes, and he ends up accidentally going back to the 1800s, where Jonathan Kent, a very young Jonathan Kent, gets in a duel with Jonah Hex, or tries to get in a duel with Jonah Hex. And that's a fun issue, I guess. According to the timeline of Superman Batman Generations, Martha and Jonathan were kind of old in like roughly 1929 when Superboy is about to become Superman. And so if they're in their 70s by that point, then it makes sense that they would have been pretty young during the life of Jonah Hex. But I don't really see what Jonathan Kent versus Jonah Hex has to do with the parademon attack. It doesn't really have anything to do with the parademon attack. Scott Free, Mr. Miracle, and Metron, they're both hanging out in Smallville at this time, and then Metron, he gives something to Superman, and then Superman comes back. It doesn't really have anything to do with the overall narrative. It's just there to kind of stall things until we get to the end of this 12-issue miniseries, and then finally Superman and Batman are able to use time travel to go to the point where Darkseid finally came up with this idea, and they're going to stop him right then and there, and then that stops all of the parademon attacks that we have seen up until this point. And if you were reading these miniseries, there are some really difficult, I guess it is difficult to wrap your head around, but it probably shouldn't have been. I will go ahead and spoil something slightly with Generations 1. Superman does not age like everyone else. At the end of the story, you have the last issue is, the first story is set in 1999, and then the second story is set in 2919. And this is a spoiler for Generations 1, so if you don't care about Generations 3, but you do want to go watch Generations, or read Generations 1, go ahead and turn this video off right now. Batman, at one point, Bruce Wayne, he takes a dip in the Lazarus Pit. And so, in 2919, he is a little bit older, but he is aging about 1 year for every 50 years. And then Superman is aging, the older he gets, the slower he ages. I don't remember exactly what he said to Bruce, but they meet up again, and it's been like 900 years since they met, because in 1999, Superman left Earth because there were so many superheroes, they didn't really need him anymore. So he leaves Earth to go and explore, and then in 2919, Bruce Wayne, he finds him, and he says, yeah, I left Earth about 300 years ago. It's become basically a paradise, and there's, hundreds and hundreds of superheroes, and they don't need Batman anymore. And so he and Superman say, let's go find a place that needs a Superman and Batman, and then it'll be like the old days, where we were taming the planet, outlaw a place like Gotham City. It'll be like that. And so when you're reading Superman Batman Generations 3, you're starting to think, wait a minute, this does not make sense with what we were told in Generations 1. That Superman left the planet in 1999, and then around 2600 or so, Batman leaves the planet, but that does not happen in Generations 3, because there are these parademon attacks that are coming every 100 years like clockwork, so it would be really irresponsible for Batman or Superman to leave Earth while these attacks are still happening. And so you're thinking, this does not fit with what John Byrne wrote and drew earlier. And John Byrne is not super concerned with continuity. For example, in Generations 1, in the 1939 story, Superman is able to jump really tall. He's able to leap tall buildings in a single bound because in 1939, Superman was not yet able to fly. But a few years later, when DC started doing Superboy stories, Superboy was able to fly. And so by the time you get to the end of this story in 2919, Batman and Superman are reminiscing about the first time they met, which was not in 1939, it was actually in 1929, when Bruce Wayne was Robin and Superman was actually Superboy. And so in that story, Superboy is able to fly. And that kind of disregard for continuity doesn't really bother me that much. He's kind of playing with how DC kind of had a disregard for continuity. How in real life, Superman was able to leap tall buildings, and then later in flashbacks he was able to fly, and stuff like that. Or you would have, this is the first time that Batman and Superman met, and then years later they might have an issue that contradicts that, or something like that. Julius Schwartz, who was the editor-in-chief of DC for a long time, or was maybe not the editor-in-chief, but he was kind of guiding a lot of the DC books, he said his motto was, anyone who's reading comics now will not be reading comics in 5 years. So in 5 years, we can tell an entirely different story about how Superman first met Krypto. And so there was a lot of contradictions in the old stories. And so in this, you kind of get a little bit of that here, but it still feels like a story with a cohesive, it doesn't feel too wacky to me. But then by the time you get to here, Superman is not aging like he was in Superman Batman Generations 1. In that, when you get to 2919, Superman has long silver locks going down to his shoulders. In Superman Batman Generations 3, Superman looks like this the entire time, with a little bit of gray in his pimples. Even when you get to 2925, Superman still looks like that. And I'm scratching my head, and I'm saying, okay, none of this fits with Generations 1. It feels like it's a completely new universe that is somehow got a little bit in common with the old universe, because we get to meet in Generations 1 Superman's grandson, who is that universe's version of Nightwing, but it's spelled K-N-I, Nightwing, that way, not N-I-G-H. And so we get to see Nightwing in Generations 1, and then here, Nightwing is here, and then at one point, Lex Luthor detonates this bomb that somehow turns Nightwing's hair white. I don't know why, but then he's not aging, but his hair has turned white. And so we are seeing characters from Superman Batman Generations 1 and 2, but it feels like it's in an entirely different world. And then, spoilers for Generations 3, because I'm sure nobody cares, at the end, they go back to whenever it is that Darkseid first comes up with this idea to send the parademons, and then they end up destroying Darkseid and all of his minions. They destroy that entire space station, and then it resets the timeline. Because the parademons were never sent back in time, then we jump to 2925, where Superman looks like this again, and then him and Batman, they're there, and then it's like, hang on a second, was I, like, they both kind of have this sense of deja vu, like they can almost remember the events of Superman Batman Generations 3, but not quite. Both of them say, like, whatever it was, I hope it wasn't important. And so I am confused. Like, I guess that person who really likes Generations 3, who said you have to put in more work to understand what's going on here, maybe they're right. Maybe I am an idiot, and maybe it's not this story's fault that it doesn't make any sense. Maybe it's my fault. But reading this, I was trying to think of, okay, what are some reasons why Superman is not aging in Generations 3 like he was in Generations 1? Because by the time you get to 2925, he doesn't look as old as he did in 2919 in Generations 1. And I was thinking, well, he spends like 500 years in this weird parallel dimension with the New Gods. I thought maybe time doesn't pass in that dimension. Maybe he's just staying still and he's not actually getting older. I don't think so, because him and the New God, Beautiful Dreamer from the Forever People, they have a couple of kids while they are stranded in that reality. And those kids grow up and become adults. So time does pass in that universe. So Superman should be aging there. And then at one point, they do jump like 300 years a little bit. At one point, Superman, it's after he's gone to the 1800s, and then he's figured something out, and then they jump for, I think by that point, because in 1925, Lois Lane and Lana Lang, they accidentally get stuck in Saturn Girl's time machine. Saturn Girl had come back to 1925 to warn Superboy and Bruce Wayne about all this, and then they get stuck in her time machine, and it's going into the future. And so then adult Superman and adult Batman meet them, and then they have to go back in time to try and put everything right. They have to put Lana and Lois back where they're supposed to be, erase their memories of everything they saw, and then they go to the future to try and stop Darkseid. So I guess they do skip over a couple of centuries at one point, but I don't think that that explains why Superman goes from looking like, goes from looking like this in 2919 to looking like this in 2925. If he only skipped like 100 years, I would think that he would be a lot closer to looking like this. I don't know. Generations 3 really just felt like it was treading water for like 80% of it. It felt like, okay, it's another 100 years. Here comes some more parademons. And every now and then, there's a nice, fun little story. For some reason, Nightwing's daughters, they don't age because the same bomb that turned Nightwing's hair white stopped their bodies from aging. So when they're like 200 years old, they have the bodies of 11-year-olds. And one of them is in love with a Green Lantern who's over 50. And yes, it is as weird and creepy as it sounds. And so she wants to expose herself to gold kryptonite, which will take away her powers, and she thinks then she will be able to age, and then there is a cure for gold kryptonite in the fortress, so once she has the body of an adult, then she can give her powers back, and then she can get with this Green Lantern. That's a nice, fun, tragic story there. But then, years later, that Supergirl, because there's two Supergirls, Supergirl Red and Supergirl Blue, that's a reference to a few different stories. That Supergirl, who earlier in Generations 3, she is calling Bruce Wayne grandfather. Long story short, I know this has already gone on way too long, but in Superman Batman Generations, Nightwing, who is Superman's grandson, he is born without powers, long story short, and he is raised believing that he is the son of Bruce Wayne Jr. And then he does get powers later on towards the end of Superman Batman Generations, and then in this story, by that point, he knows that he is the grandson of Superman, not the grandson of Batman. However, his daughters, for a few issues in Generations 3, they are referring to Batman as grandfather. And then later, Supergirl Blue is in a romantic relationship with the man that she called grandfather. She is not related to him by blood. She is not related to Batman in any way, but it is still super creepy that this girl who was calling Batman grandfather earlier in the miniseries, later in the miniseries, is calling him honey, and is presumably having relationships with him behind the scenes. It's really, really gross. And speaking of really gross, at one point, Superman, looking like this, ends up making out with Lana Lang, who is 14, a time-traveling Lana Lang. He kisses her on the lips, making out, I don't know. It's gross, it's weird, it's creepy, and like one page earlier, he tells Lana, you're 14, and I'm definitely an adult. I'm like 800 by now. And then she says, yeah, but who cares? No one's here to arrest you. He says, oh, okay. And then he kisses her, and then her mind gets a wipe. And ew, it's gross, gross. Everything about it is gross. If you find the concept of what if these characters aged in real time, if you find that to be really interesting, go ahead and track this down. It might be a little hard to find. I think it's out of print. I have no idea how much it will cost you if you just buy it on Amazon. This is the only story you really need to worry about. This one is fine. It's fairly harmless, especially compared to Generations 3. It's basically just there to say, hey, look, this Green Lantern met that Green Lantern. And hey, look, Black Hawk has a descendant who's also a descendant of Hawkman. When I was reading Generations 3, or this whole omnibus, there was like a foreword for each miniseries that was originally published when those minis were coming out. And at the beginning of Generations 3, John Byrne is saying, like, Black Hawk had a son who married Hawkman and Hawkgirl's daughter. And I was thinking, oh, that would have been nice to have found that out in the comic, because you don't find that out in Generations 2. Just all of a sudden, you've got, I think her name is Black Hawk. She's kind of got a costume. Let me just see if she's on here anywhere. I don't. Yes, she is here right above Superman's head. That is Black Hawk. So her costume is kind of sort of like a combination between Hawkman and Black Hawk. But at the beginning of Generation 3, he says, yeah, there's this character. Her dad is so-and-so and her mom is so-and-so. And I was thinking, we didn't find that out in Generation 2. She just shows up at one point, and we're just kind of meant to put the dots together. So anyway, if you find this premise to be really interesting, yes, it's up to you. You don't have to, but you can if you really want to, and then absolutely not. Don't do it. If you are really wanting to read Generation 3, please take my word for it. Don't do it. There's not a whole lot of story here, and then a lot of it is just really ew. I don't like it. The only thing that I do like about it is that Byrne is able to work in OMAC and Kamandi into the timeline of Superman Batman Generations. Lex Luthor in, I think, 2025 sets off this weird EMP device that basically destroys all power sources on Earth for like 300 years. And so when we get to 2125, we find out that Kamandi was actually the grandson of OMAC, and I think that was something from DC Comics from before, not a Jack Kirby idea, but somebody else had come up with that idea outside of this world. But we find out OMAC, he was a hero in 2025, and then in 2125 we see an adult Kamandi and his, spoilers, his daughter, and we find out that all the talking animal people were actually projects from Cadmus Labs. That's a really cool idea. I just wish that the rest of the miniseries was as interesting as that one issue. So yeah, I absolutely do not recommend this omnibus. It looks nice, it holds up well, but if you really want a good story, just get this one. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but just get this one. So that is all that I have to say about the Superman Batman Generations epic. I hope you guys liked this video, and if you did, I will see you in the future with something else. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.